The Persian Immortals. You've probably seen them depicted as this terrifying, inhuman horde, right? But the real story, well, it's so much more complex and honestly way more fascinating than the movies would have you believe. So, let's dive in and really unmask this legend, separating the myth from the actual men.
So that brings us to the big question. Who were the real Persian Immortals? I mean, were they some kind of unstoppable supernatural force, or was there something else going on entirely? To get to the bottom of this, we're going to have to peel back all those layers of fiction and dig right into the historical record. And this right here perfectly illustrates that divide. On one side, you have the pop culture version, and on the other, an actual carving from the Palace of Darius in Susa. I mean, you can see the difference immediately, right? One is pure spectacle designed to look cool on screen. The other is a real historical artifact. That gap between them, that's what we're here to explore.
Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the version of the Immortals that pretty much all of us know. You know, the one forged in Hollywood and comic books. This is the legend we've got to take apart piece by piece.
Yeah, think about the movie 300. Those inhuman, masked warriors with swords that look, well, kind of Japanese, or even older movies where they're just dressed all in black. The theme is always the same, right? They're this mysterious, monstrous force. And look, it's a powerful image, for sure, but it's almost completely made up. So that begs the question, if this isn't who they were, then who were they?
To get to the real story, we have to go back in time and talk to our main source on this, the Greek historian Herodotus. He's really the guy who gave them their famous name and first described what made them so special.
10,000. Just let that number sink in. This wasn't some endless, faceless horde like you see in the movies. No, this was a very specific, very elite unit of 10,000 professional soldiers, right at the very heart of the Persian army. And that number, it was everything. It was their whole identity.
And here's where we get that famous name. According to Herodotus, the unit's strength was always exactly 10,000. If a soldier was killed or even just got sick, a replacement stepped in immediately. So imagine you're on the opposing side. It would look like you couldn't make a dent in their numbers, like they were literally impossible to kill, truly immortal. It's an amazing piece of psychological warfare. But what if the whole thing was just a massive misunderstanding? Okay, this is where things get really fascinating. Some historians think Herodotus' source might have gotten two Old Persian words mixed up because they sounded so similar. You have Anushya, which means companion, and Anosha, which means immortal. See how close those sound? So think about that. Could their real name have been the Companions, which would make a lot of sense given how close they were to the king? It is totally possible that this legendary name we all know is based on a simple 2,500-year-old mix-up. Scholars are still debating it, but wow, what a great layer of mystery to add to the story, right?
All right, so we've talked about their name and their number. Now let's get into what they actually look like. And I'll give you a hint. You can forget the black masks and, the ninja-style getup. The reality is way more colorful and, frankly, a lot more interesting.
And what's really wild is that even the ancient historians couldn't totally agree on this. You've got Herodotus on one hand, describing them with lighter gear, wicker shields, scale armor. But then you have another guy, Xenophon, who talks about heavy bronze breastplates and helmets. Now, this could just mean they used different gear for different battles or in different time periods. But what it definitely tells us is there wasn't one single, unchanging, immortal look. But this is where we get to the bling. Seriously, when they were on ceremonial duty, the Immortals were the exact opposite of a dark, scary horde. Herodotus himself said they glittered with gold. Just look at this relief from Darius's palace. You see these soldiers in these gorgeous, elaborate robes. This wasn't about scaring people on the battlefield. This was about showing off the incredible wealth and power of the Persian Empire.
So, if we were to lay out their typical battlefield kit, what would we see? Well, these guys were super versatile. They had powerful bows for fighting at a distance, and then for close-up work, they had short spears and a sword called an asinices. For defense, they'd carry a big wicker shield and wear a coat of scale armor that Herodotus said looked like the scales of a fish. And check out this detail. The little counterweights on the ends of their spears were silver for regular troops and solid gold for the officers. That's how you know you're dealing with an elite unit.
Okay. So they looked the part, they had the gear, but what did they actually do? Well, the Immortals were the absolute backbone of the Persian army. They were the ones on the front lines, carving out one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And this timeline just gives you a snapshot of how busy they were.
I mean, look at this. They're there for the conquest of Babylon. They're in Egypt. They're campaigning all the way out in the Indus Valley. And of course, who can forget their most famous appearance at the Battle of Thermopylae against the Spartans? For decades, if the empire was expanding, you can bet the Immortals were leading the charge. And they weren't just about brute force. Their tactics were incredibly disciplined and super effective. Here's how it would go down. First, the front line would plant their huge shields in the ground, making a solid wall. Then, from behind that cover, waves of archers would just rain arrows down on the enemy. Once the enemy line was softened up and in chaos, the infantry would charge forward with their spears and swords to finish the job. It was this perfect combined arm strategy, and it worked like a charm.
But their job wasn't over when the battle was won. When they weren't out on campaign, the Immortals had another, maybe even more prestigious role. They were the personal bodyguards of the King of Kings himself. So you've got this dual role, elite shock troops and the royal guard. That really cemented them as the absolute best of the best.
Of course, the Achaemenid Empire didn't last forever, but the idea of the Immortals, this concept of an elite, unbreakable unit, well, that turned out to be, well, pretty immortal itself.
And this is maybe the most incredible part of their whole story. The name just kept going. Later Persian empires had their own Immortals. The Byzantine Empire revived the name. Even Napoleon called his elite imperial guard the Immortals. Fast forward to the 20th century, the Shah of Iran's personal guard was called the Javidan, the Immortals. And get this, even today the name is used as an insignia for some of Iran's special forces brigades. The name itself just won't quit.
So when you strip it all away, the real Immortals weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They were just incredibly elite, highly skilled soldiers. But their reputation became so powerful that their name became a symbol of military excellence for thousands of years. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? What's more powerful in the end? The strength of the soldier or the strength of the story that we tell about them?